The big question is, what does the pandemic teach? Okay, welcome. I am here with Claudia Rankine. Claudia is a noted poet and now playwright. She teaches in the English and African American Studies programs at Yale, and is the author of several volumes, including Nothing in Nature is Private, Don't Let Me Be Lonely, An American Lyric, The End of the Alphabet, Plot, Citizen, An American Lyric, and The White Card, a play. Welcome, Claudia, and thank you for joining us.
And Just Us is about to hit the shelves.
Oh, great, okay. Congratulations, that's great. Who published that?
Graywolf, my people.
It's beautiful. So, this is quite a moment we're living in. It goes without saying. I would love to hear you between the onset of the pandemic in February and March, and then the surge in the Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of the George Floyd murder, I would just love to hear you narrate your own experience of this extraordinary time that we've been living through these last 5 or 6 months.
If we think about the last 5 or 6 months, there is no way anyone could have anticipated the virus and its impact exactly, though we know that the Obama administration had a commission because they apparently had anticipated some version of it. So that part of it, I think we all understand that it's not the virus that's the problem, but the way in which it's been managed. That we've had an administration that in no way intends to, because I think this is going forward in the future, intends to prepare or protect the American public in terms of the domino effect of this kind of global pandemic. And that's been the most tragic part of it. That the police violence has continued during the pandemic is not surprising. We've had versions of George Floyd's murder for as long as I have been living. I didn't see that as so unusual. I think the unusual part of it was the blatant disregard of Chauvin, the police officer, and that it was filmed and that we were all at home and we all had to sit with it for all of those minutes. I think that was unusual. The grassroots response to what happened, that I think actually was not accidental or incidental, or I think that Black Lives Matter started in 2014, I believe, and grassroots organizations have been organizing between then and now. So I think people didn't understand how groups like Showing Up for Racial Justice, Say Her Name, Kimberly Crenshaw's group, and then the various segments of Black Lives Matter across the country were actually working this whole time. And so they just had to activate the things that they had been doing. So I wasn't surprised by the fact that people were out. I was surprised by who was out. I didn't realize how integrated those grassroots movements had become. And certainly the latest iteration in Portland with the mothers, to see white women finally understand the amount of power that they actually have by the Women's March in Washington at the beginning of this administration. So I think there were lots of movements that prepared us for this reaction. The threads, we could even go as far back as Arab Spring, so that these global protests were beginning without a central leader. That's also important, I think. I think that nobody's waiting for the one guy or the one woman to come out and say, we're marching now. People are making decisions within their own cities, within their own communities, within their own organizations.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, it's so important. I just want to underscore two, not, they aren't contradictory, but they're just two different dimensions that you just articulated. One is the extent to which we really have, whether we knew it or not, we really have laid down an infrastructure for this kind of protest that we might not have been aware of. But going back to Ferguson, or probably even further, but there was just a web of networks and social relationships that were just ripe to take to the streets at this moment. So that's one piece of it. But the other, one of the first things you said, and I think this is so profound, is that there's a sense in which the pandemic really fed this, not only in the sense that the pandemic heightened so many of the problems, but that the pandemic had us all at home sharing the moment together in a way that people had focus for the George Floyd murder in a way that they just didn't, even for some of the, in this age of cell phone witness. I mean, there have just been scores of heartrending and horrible videos that have gone viral, and we've seen them all. But we haven't really focused on any of them the way we focused on George Floyd, and that might owe a little bit to the pandemic and the fact that we had nowhere else to go. We just had to kind of confront it there in our living rooms collectively.
And we had no one to manage it. That was the other thing. I think during the Obama era, we would have Obama coming out saying, this could have been my son, this could have been me. So you had a sense that it was being managed. But now we have a president who's a nationalist, a white nationalist. Yeah. And so it was up to us at this point. But you're right, I totally agree with you that we had a kind of focus that we've never had before, given the pandemic.
Given what we've seen in terms of just the, whatever it is now, 72 straight days of protest in some cities, how much hope do you have in this moment? I mean, it's a very hard moment to be optimistic, but on the other hand, we do seem to be seeing a kind of progressive social formation that isn't quite like anything we've seen in a generation. How are you looking at our collective future long about now?
I think I still believe that this is the most hopeful I have ever been. And part of it has to do with the fact that people understand, or seem to be understanding from the rhetoric, that we're talking about systemic change, not an individual, not a bad guy, not white people over here or white people over there or anything, but that this, Matt, is sort of your work. This is the work that you have done in terms of teaching people how to think about whiteness as structural, a thing constructed with aims and commitments within the United States. And I think for the first time, I see organizations understanding that. I see even the government in some ways acknowledging that. Not everyone, obviously, but I feel like the rhetoric and the desire for education and reformation is coming as much from institutions as it's coming from individuals. And that's the thing that gives me hope.
Mm-hmm. It's so funny that you should say that, and thank you, because I was thinking the same thing about your work. I was thinking, the question I've been asking everybody is, what does the pandemic teach? And there's a very real sense in which, to me, the pandemic teaches things that you've been saying for a decade or more, right? Especially Citizen. I think of a book like Citizen and all that it has to say about our society of aggression, really. I've been thinking a lot about Citizen and thinking about, as a poet who's been focused so much on questions of social justice, does this moment open up a space for you to do a new kind of writing, a different kind of writing, or to push your writing maybe further than you feel that you've been able to? Because it seems like your natural audience has suddenly not only multiplied, but has actually caught up with, or is much closer in its thinking to where you've been in your thinking.
Well, thank you for that as well. I do think that a lot of us have been out there saying these things for many, many years. And these things, I mean, the culture of anti-Black violence will catch up with us. We really need to look at it. We need to face it. We need to understand that it can start small and land big and often ends in the murder of Black people. And also, conversely, that white nationalism is real and active and a real force in terms of how things have been organized in the United States inside this democracy. For a while, I felt like when I first started saying these things and writing these things, people were sort of, good for you, Claudia. Okay, thank you. And it was, I can't tell you, Matt, sometimes I would go into these auditoriums with thousands of people, and you could just feel the lack of love in a way, not love, but the sense of like, we don't really want to hear this. We don't need to hear it. Just do your thing, and thank you very much.
We're here a sense of civic obligation.
Exactly. And it really took a kind of internal force to just do it anyway, to understand that it was not the popular thing to say. I was not in a moment of total agreement publicly, and that it couldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. That I knew what I knew, and I was going to say it. And there were people like you who had been doing the work, and Robin DiAngelo is getting a lot of flack right now, but I think she'd been doing the work, and all these people, and I was going to bring them with me. I was going to bring them all with me. I was going to say, look at this person, do this, say this, Baldwin, everything. I was going to do it. And sometimes it felt very lonely. And it's not that I haven't been lauded and given prizes and things like that, but that doesn't really account for the moment when you're actually in real time. And you have these white men glaring at you. So it is nice, nice is a weird word, but it's an interesting moment for me as an artist, because I do feel like suddenly I'm in real time. People are saying things that I have been saying as ordinary things now. And that's kind of cool. But then it does ask me, what am I going to say next if I don't need to be saying those things? And so for me, the pandemic is really a time where I can kind of step back, think about other channels and pathways to go down in terms of my own work. So I do appreciate this moment as a moment of reflection as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that play that we were, my understanding is that you were just on the verge of opening.
We were in previews. So we hadn't technically opened, but we were in previews. And we had 3 shows. So I feel almost like we went to a festival with, like it had its weekend performance and then we shut down. So I don't feel that I didn't get to see the thing that we had been building for months. It was the most collaborative piece of work I'd ever done. And in that way, it was incredibly satisfying. Shamel Pitts, the choreographer, I should tell you it was basically a show that adapted the piece I wrote for the New York Times on speaking to white men in liminal spaces. And so the choreographer had 19 white men to work with, and they became kind of a chorus in the piece. And Rosalind Russ was the actress who, in a sense, was playing me. And so in a sentence, the play really was, you cannot vote for this man again. Those of you, 63% of white men, you put this man in power. He did not fool you. He told you he was anti-immigrant, anti-Black, anti-women, and you said, okay. And maybe the election was stolen, maybe the Russians were involved, but 63% of you did vote for him. And so the play was really that. It was like, you did this, you can turn it around.
How was the response in your weekend festival there? You did get 3 different audiences.
We had 3 different audiences. We had 3 nights of standing ovations. And as far as I know, the play was pretty much sold out up to opening night. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
It's a very tough time to be thinking about mounting a play, but are there any plans, or is it your hope to bring it back in any form, or does it feel like its moment is past?
In as much as that was the message, let's say I am hoping.
We can only hope. That
I can only hope, but I'm honored to be in a position where I want my work to be totally irrelevant, but I want it to be totally irrelevant.
That is exactly the thing, but it never will be. This is the lesson of our political culture, because I've had many moments, well, not many, but I've had a few moments like that myself. For about a minute after Obama was elected, It really was only about a minute. I thought, man, and this thing I've devoted my career to for 20 years is like, wow, we're in a new moment. Well, actually, no,
No.
we're not.
I know.
We were so not in a new moment. And
Yeah.
thinking about the Obama years and the Trump years together is really useful, because we are kind of locked in this deadly embrace in this country between the forces of white nationalism and the forces of a kind of multiracial progressivism. And I think we're going to be locked here for a while.
While the executive branch has been doing what it's been doing, we've had a Senate run by Mitch McConnell, who's been putting for life judges in positions all over this country. It's been happening, and they are there for life. And we all know that mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow, is the new apparatus of slavery. So we could have, I don't know who the ideal president and the ideal VP would be, and a totally new Senate. It's not going to change.
So there's the same structure.
Yeah, the structure.
The new volume you have coming out in a few weeks, is that another volume of poetry?
No, it has a few poems in it. It's a volume of essays. It includes the New York Times essay on speaking to white men. The premise of the book was really what happens when we talk about race. Why are we going off the rails? Why are we getting so upset? And the we includes me, like, what is this all about? So I had this thought when I taught Construction to Whiteness. A lot of my students went off and interviewed their roommates, their parents, their friends about what whiteness meant to them. And that class was more a class to create art. So people made films and books and things like that. And so I could try this. So that's what led me to talking to the white men. But then I began to think about, well, what about all these other conversations I have? Why am I saying the things that I'm saying? And why are these white people saying the things they're saying to me? And so whenever I didn't go looking for the conversation, I really don't think I did this consciously. If I did it unconsciously, I wasn't aware of it. But when a conversation would come up that really turned a question of how we perceive race in this country, I wrote it down. And then I hired a psychiatrist in town to talk to me about why I would have had the feelings, the thoughts that I had during the conversations and why I said some of the things that I said. And I incorporated that into the essay. And then I hired a fact checker, and he and I would go through all the implied facts. And those were also put on the side of the essay. So, sometimes it would be like that. I know why I said that, but actually the real fact is that it's this percent, not this percent. And so those corrections were made. And then there was a lawyer who looked through it, a sociologist who looked through it. And then I sent it back. So let's say one of those conversations occurred with you. I sent it to you. I said, I would say, Matt, this is the conversation I think we had. Do you think we had this conversation? Do you feel like you were represented correctly? Did you say the things I said you said? And some people said, yeah. Nobody said this was not the conversation. Everybody said, yes, this was the conversation. Yes, I said these things. A few people said, I didn't mean what you say I meant. I said it, but I didn't mean it the way you read it. And then I would say, well, do you want to write a response about what you were thinking and what you were intending to communicate? And if they said yes, that became an addition to the essay. So my piece would end and their response would happen. And so that's the sort of format of the book.
Yeah, that's a fascinating process. What do you know now that you didn't know going in?
Well, I think I learned a lot because of having to do the fact check. So they're actual facts that I didn't actually have.
Facts are a thing.
Facts are nice.
As a society, we're forgetting that rapidly. But yes, facts
yeah, but the facts are good. But I think in terms of the actual mechanics of having a conversation, one of the things I saw in myself was a kind of petulance that I needed to rein in. You know, I think, a little bit committed to being right rather than engaging. And so I think what I learned over the course of taking these conversations apart is that being right is not that interesting. It's important, but it's not interesting. What's interesting is staying in the conversation and being open and seeing sort of where it can go if you give a little here and you give a little there, and trying to understand sort of what the other person's investment. And I think this wasn't a question I had for myself before. What is their investment in wanting to say this? Rather than, are they right? I know that's not right. But why should that then close down the conversation?
Right. Let us understand each other.
Yeah, let's understand. Let's figure out why you want it. Why do you want to keep going with that? And so that made me more curious in a way in terms of the conversation. Yeah, because I started asking myself, why do you have conversation? Why do we have them?
How did you choose your interlocutors?
I didn't choose them. That's what I mean. As far as I know, these moments happened with wild abandon and randomness. One of the piece that I think most people in the press has referenced in the book, happened at Fairview. Because I'm one of the members of the Racial Imaginary Institute, where we think about race and think about the construction of race in this country, Fairview offered us tickets to come to see the play. And so we went. And then, as you know, at the end of the play, they asked the white people to get on stage. And one of our white members refused to get on stage. And suddenly I was just like, we are now part of the problem. The Racial Imaginary Institute is now the problem. So I was sitting in my seat becoming enraged at it. But I couldn't turn to her and say, get up and go on stage. But I was just waiting and waiting. And after a while, I couldn't even hear the play because I was just like, what is she doing? Why won't she go up there? What is going on? And so she never goes up. And the play ends. And I turn to her and I say, I didn't know you were Black. And then I leave, and that was it. That night we went, it was pouring rain. And that was the last thing we said to each other that night. And, this is a friend of mine, and this is somebody committed to conversations around race, teaches. And so I, over the course of the week, waited for her to say something. And she didn't. And then finally I said something, and then that's for example. And then she's one of the people who wrote a very long and detailed response as to why she did not go up.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not you buy it, I find a lot of white people are like, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. What she says, so she's giving people an umbrella. But whether or not you buy it, it is a thoughtful response.
Uh-huh.
So that's what I mean. Like the moment, like I didn't know that was going to happen.
Right.
Another conversation happened randomly because we were at a dinner party and one writing a book on the election and insisted that the major factor in the election was economics and that he had run on economics. And I said, no, he ran on racism. And that turned into a big mess, that conversation.
Mm.
Such a big mess that I that's one of the ones where I didn't go back and ask for a response because we got to the point where John said to me, should we leave? So I didn't know when they were coming.
Right.
I was just having my life and then ba-bam.
Were most of the people grateful to you for the opportunity to come back and revisit these exchanges and to kind of think about them more deeply?
I think grateful is not the right word. I mean, I would say the New York Times piece has 3 different types of conversations in it. One of them is with a white man who comes to the edge of talking about race, but needs me to bring it there, and I refuse to bring it there, so we don't talk about it. The second one, the guy says to me, my kid wants to go to Yale, but some minority took his spot. And, you know, and that's a typical performance of that kind of thing. But he was game to talk. You know, he was like, yeah, let's talk. And the third one was a man who I'm sitting with in first class, and he's very nice and really is somebody who I thought if I knew this guy in my real life, he would be my friend. He was a perfectly amiable guy. And then as we were talking, and he says, I don't see color. And I'm like, what? What is that? And he's somebody who he and I have become friends. Because after that conversation, he looked me up, bought my books, called, emailed to me. And when I finished writing that piece, I sent it to him because I didn't want our conversation to show up in the New York Times when we'd had such a nice conversation without letting him know. So I sent it to him and I said, you know, I just want you to know that I did write our conversation and here it is. And if there's anything you think I'm misrepresenting, let me know. And by the way, it's going to be in my book. So if you have a response, I would love to print that response. And he wrote a response that was really surprising to me. Mm-hmm. He said that he had actually told me things that weren't true, but that he didn't know why he had done it. And they were just innocent things like, growing up, race was never an issue. Nobody in my family's racist. The kind of racial strife that we're encountering now is not something I ever knew. You know, he said things like that. And then he said after going home and thinking about it, he realized all through high school, the boys were fighting each other and race was a real thing. But for some reason in his mind, he did not want to go there.
Right.
And since the protests, he's somebody who has written to me to say that he's a CEO of some corporation. And their corporation has done all the things everybody's done, given money to X, Y, and Z thing. But then they've gone further. They've had Friday lunch chats about racial issues, and he says he's going to continue them throughout the year, and they have done real substantive things. So that's one where he did come back and say, hey, yeah. It's deeper than I knew.
I'm curious how you would characterize your aims in a project like that. Is this book trying to accomplish something different from a book like Citizen, or is it just similar work in a different register, or how do you understand it? Because as you describe it, I mean, it sounds like it's more, I mean, it almost sounds like a step towards the kind of truth and reconciliation conversation that this country really needs. It sounds like it's a step towards actual healing almost, or could be. And I just wondered how you thought about that.
Well, I think one of the things that I learned, you know, you asked me earlier what I learned in doing this. One of the things that I learned is that often when I'm speaking to somebody, as a Black person, my reality is not their reality. And that when they say, I don't know, they really don't. And that their inability to understand is not malicious. I think in a way I was assuming that white people were like performing the stuff our president performs, you know, where he knows, but he will refuse to admit that he knows. And I think in what I gained from these conversations is a real sense that they don't know what redlining is. They don't know about the Tulsa riots. They don't know that Linda Fierstein, the woman who prosecuted the Central Park jogger case, lied about everything. They don't know. The fact that I follow that stuff and it imprints on me has nothing to do with my neighbor. They don't know. And so there is a real need for us to understand our lack of education. And, you know, there's one conversation in the book that I have with an artist who is Cuban. And this also happened randomly. I was at a dinner party and I said something about somebody who is Hispanic that was sort of dismissal. It was a sort of a statement that, you know, it was like a dinner party statement where you're like, well, the Hispanic community are the junior partners in white supremacy, something like that. And because of the ability to pass and I understand that the desire to assimilate inside a structure where you are no longer the target is something that is human. And as she began to ask me questions, I realized I don't know a lot of the stuff she knows. You know, she was like, have you read this book? Do you know who this guy is? Did you do this? And I was like, no, I didn't. So it is that the book really asks us to kind of think about from where we are positioned and what we go into these conversations with and without. And that, I think, will allow us to be a little bit more open to where that other person is coming from.
Right. The thing that you're talking about, on the one hand, I do think that there is a distinction to be made between the kind of virulent, full-throated kind of racism that, you know, we see in Charlottesville versus a more, I don't want to use the word innocent exactly, but a less, a kind of unthinking, unprogrammatic kind of racism. And yet it's also the case that the kind of not knowing that we're talking about, in the case of those white people, it's a not knowing that is fully defended by white supremacism and white privilege.
Exactly.
It is the luxury to not know, and the luxury to not even care if you know, or the luxury to not think that there's anything that you don't know that could possibly be important. And the culture has really defended that ignorance to the death.
Yeah.
Really.
I mean, they constructed that. I think it's beyond defense. It's that ignorance. These things are not taught in schools. The histories were erased. I mean, you know, you would think that Tulsa riots, it's the one time the United States bombed its own people. You think that would be news.
Right.
You know?
And now, you know, thanks to the Watchmen, now everybody knows about it.
Yeah, now everybody knows about it. So it's interesting that Hollywood has had such an effect on the cultural literacy of this country as well.
Right. No, I think that's always been the case, although I think it's more pronounced now just because we're just several generations in now to the real project of desegregating the culture industries. And so we're just further in the project. But I've always thought that, you know, that kind of cultural work is absolutely indispensable. Like, you don't get from Nixon's Southern strategy to the election of Barack Obama without the work that culture does.
Exactly.
Like, you can't tell that story without all those, you know, Spike Lees and everybody else who was like really out there kind of changing minds.
No, exactly. That's why culture is important.
Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation. Is there anything, as you reflect on our moment, on the pandemic and the kind of danger that we're all in, and also the hope, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you feel that we should have?
Well, one thing that I'm interested in knowing what you think about it, is how much resilience do you think we have to continue this? I mean, obviously we will continue it, and we will be able to continue it because that will be living. But I'm just curious, can we maintain a lockdown system for another year and a half? And if we do, how do we show up for the number of people who are falling, that we don't really see?
Yeah.
I mean, that's been my question to me. And it's not really a question about sort of what kind of my work, but it is a question about my life, what I should be doing, because I mean, people are losing their jobs. A woman I know told me that her husband worked for a hotel in New York. The hotel changed its name so it could get rid of its union, so that now all of the people who worked, if they come back as it's reopened,
It'll be a non-union.
Don't belong to the union anymore. So they no longer have any responsibilities to them. So all of that kind of stuff is going on, especially in the art community, art world. People have been living as artists with great precarity, with the hope that the next thing is coming down the line. And certainly in the theater community, that's not the case. And will that mean that people will leave New York? Will they make other kinds of decisions around their career. It's just those are the kinds of questions that I've been thinking about.
The costs to each of us individually, but also the costs to us collectively of trying to manage this pandemic the way that we have, the costs are just enormous. And I think we haven't even come close to calculating what they are. And by costs, I mean the psychic costs.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that we don't have a president who's interested in grieving at all, I think is just taking a toll.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I mean, it's just hard to imagine as this thing stretches out, which is going to do for some unknown number of probably years, kind of what the world looks like when we're at the other side of this, or how far we can go along the line that we're on without just a total in the streets kind of social breakdown. We don't talk about that much, but
the pressure, there is a certain kind of pressure that is building, that is separate from the kind of protests around injustice. Capitalism is supposed to function one way, and if it breaks down, then we're going to see a kind of lawlessness we haven't seen before.
Yeah. There was a great piece a week or so ago by Masha Gessen talking about the similarities she sees between the breakdown of Russian society and the rise of Putin a decade and a half ago versus what we're witnessing here in the United States. And she says the thing that they have in common is a level of inequality that's so absolutely stark, and the gap is so wide that in both cases, different as these two cultures are, in both cases, the people that you might call the ruling class see themselves as so apart from where the real problems are lived that there's an incomprehension and a kind of lack of empathy and an uncaring that that's extraordinary, except as Gessen is saying, it's actually not extraordinary. It's like it's what you get when inequality reaches a certain point.
Yeah.
And it's sobering. I mean, it's hard to think our way out of this.
Yeah.
Given the kind of political structures that we've inherited and broken.
Yeah. And the medical system that is completely inept. That we corporations, the insurance industry, the medical industry, have relied on as a money-making endeavor. I'm interested in this idea of grieving. I'm going to think about that, Matt, as I move forward.
Well, it's just kind of astonishing and appalling that we've lost 160,000 souls, and we scarcely even pause to mention it.
Yeah, we don't mention it, and yet I think one of the things I have been thinking a lot about are all of these videos of white women, the Karens.
The Karens.
And running around out there, I think depositing their grief into anti-Black racism. Because it's just bizarre that these people are suddenly like, I hate the N-words, I hate them. And I think, people, it's true that it's racist what they're doing. But there's also, I think, another element of a kind of breakdown of sanity.
Yeah, well, there's a kind of nihilism, right?
And a loss of civility that is about internal stuff, not external stuff. And I think that might be tied to the grieving, and what the president has given them is a place to put it in anti-Black racism. That it's somehow that equation works for them. But I don't think yes, they're racist, but I don't think that is what's gotten them motivated to run out in the streets and shout it to the skies.
Right.
I think there is a level of nihilism, a level of grief, a level of fear, of panic that is at play.
Yeah.
And that's in part what we're seeing.
Yeah, and it's being stirred. It's being really consciously stirred.
Yeah, consciously stirred up, and use for ill-gotten gains, I'd say.
Thank you so much for the conversation. Thank you for taking the time.
See you soon.